Tell me a little bit about that and your biggest takeaways from your media training.
Yeah, don't wear your sunglasses during the interview.
When you're driven, the need to accomplish a goal is relentless. Hard work and ambition compel you to do whatever's necessary. In my work as a personal injury trial lawyer for 18 years, it's common to meet driven people. Those with drive can have different personalities, careers, or backgrounds, but they possess one common factor. Despite their passions, driven people want to surround and motivate themselves with other driven people. If you want to learn how to overcome obstacles by learning from others, then tune in here. This is the Driven Crowd Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into episode 54 of the Driven Crowd Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Snellings. My guest today is Steve Riley. Steve has served a 37-year career in law enforcement. The majority of this career was spent in investigatory functions, including serving as Division Commander of Investigations and Special Services. Upon his retirement in May of 2017, Steve was the Lieutenant of Crimes Against Persons Unit of the Criminal Investigations Division. He has served in supervisory or command positions for recruitment, testing, and hiring. For about the last 25 years, Steve has trained officers at both the academy and in-service level. After leaving the police department, Steve served as Mayor of Van Alstyne. In 2003, he created the Cobalt Agency, a private investigative firm. Steve, welcome to the Driven Crowd Podcast.
Scott, thanks for having me. It's great to be able to speak to an attorney that's not on the opposite side and an antagonism that I know is going to be grilling me and trying to tear apart my testimony.
Hey, I tell you what, we just got started. You don't know. I may come after you, Steve.
Well, it can't be what I've already. It's got to be better than what's been done before. But.
Well, given your experience, I'm sure you would hold up just fine. So let's start off with, how did you decide to become a police officer?
Well, it was either that or probably become a crook. I think I believe this is one of those things that I knew that I was always supposed to be a police officer. And, I've run into many people over the years. They searched for what they were supposed to be. There's just search for what they were supposed to do. And I truly believe I was led into police work. It was a God thing, nothing else. I never had to look for what I was supposed to be. For me, police work was good to me. I hope I was good to it. And I was a privilege to get to do it. And I hope everybody else that goes into that business, they feel the same way.
And so were you one of those little kids running around playing, cops and robbers, and you had your police kit and it just grew from there? Or how did you become interested in becoming a police officer?
I didn't have a police kit, but I always played hide and seek. I always wanted to search for people. But it was really the chase that I enjoyed more than anything else. And I just, back when you're a child, you don't really know what you're doing, but it's what comes natural. And I think as I got older, it began to manifest itself to me that, hey, this is what you're going to be. This is what you're going to do.
So when did you, I guess at what age did you enter the police academy?
I was 23. I had started at Dallas Sheriff's Office working in the jails. I was a detention officer for 2 years. And I knew that wasn't what I was going to be. But right. So like every other young guy that you dream, you serve your time doing learning the business, and then start taking exams in cities where you think you might like to work. And fortunately, my first job was at McKinney Police Department, and I enjoyed it there, and I stayed there my entire police career.
Oh, wow. So were you hired on for the McKinney Police Department, and then they put you through the academy?
That's the way it worked for me. Yeah, and there are some people that put themselves through academies. Not me. I was hired along with another guy who's now a judge in Collin County, and we attended the academy together. I still lived in Dallas. We drove to Arlington to the Regional Police Academy every day for how many hundreds of hours we had to go. And then once I was through the academy, I moved to McKinney, and because it was quicker to drive from East Dallas to Arlington than it was from McKinney to Arlington every day.
So I had a friend who went through the Frisco Police Academy, or a police academy through the Department of Frisco a couple years back. And he was showing me the stories, or showing me the videos of when he got maced and when he got tased. Did they do that back in the day when you went through?
Well, first of all, pepper spray wasn't a thing when I went through the police academy, and neither were tasers. However, later on in the business, pepper spray came about and tasers. And yes, I experienced both. I was a pepper spray instructor, and the rule was you don't have to get sprayed unless you want to pass the class.
We're not going to make anybody do it.
That's exactly what they said. And so, yes, it's an interesting exercise. They spray you, then they make you run. And then you have to run, and you have to spray 5 styrofoam heads and then run back. And what you don't really know at the time when you're running, it actually makes it feel better because the air is blowing the spray off your face. And that's the best way to mitigate the spray.
I have never experienced pepper spray, thankfully, but I do remember. I think it was a friend from high school. She had some mace on her keys, and I was fumbling around, and I ended up spraying it, and I was downwind of it, and so I got a little bit in my eyes, and good night. I never wanted to be around that stuff again. And I just had a very little bit of it. I can't imagine having a full-on spray right in my eyes.
I'm not going to say that we didn't spray in other officers' cars before they went on shift. And I'm not going to say that maybe if they were training somewhere outside, we didn't let some drift towards them a little bit. The stuff is insidious.
It really is.
It really. And if you get it on you, don't use water to wash it off because the chlorine in the water just makes it worse.
Oof. All right. So you went through the police academy, and then towards further on in your career, you started teaching at the police academy. So tell me this: of the people who had I don't want to say the easiest time, but the people who performed the best throughout the police academy, what are some certain traits that you noticed in them?
Well, let me back up a second. Let's go back before they get in academy. A lot of that's discovered during the oral interview.
Okay.
So when we are selecting officers, one, I really like having people with military experience. One, because they're used to being trained and they accept training better than a lot of people because they're used to having pressure put on them. Now that doesn't negate the fact that there are many other good applicants, but people with military experience really they're used to having the training, and it is a paramilitary organization, so that helps some. But the things that I always look for were people that have a tenacity. People that we certainly look for intelligence, but we look for people that were tenacious, that wouldn't give up, that were, no matter how dire the circumstances seemed, and we would put them under some moderate pressure in a oral board, usually scenarios, things like that. And I was looking to see, even if you were under pressure, could you still think and could you still rationalize why you came to the decision? And it wasn't necessarily concerned with what decision you made, but could you rationalize and tell me why you made that decision? And because they're searching for am I saying the right answer?
Right.
I didn't really look for the right answer because you don't know. And if you get the right answers, I'm just going to change the scenario until I can put pressure on you and see, do you have the ability to think under pressure?
And so I think for a lot of people who are interviewing for employers or managers or things like that, interviewing for new team members, would love to have a little bit deeper insight on how do you craft your questions to really make them think and put them under that pressure to see if, hey, can they perform under pressure? Because I know, in what we do, it's a high stress job. There's a lot of pressure. We have people's futures riding on our shoulders, and you got to get the job done, period. So what are some things that you use, like some specific techniques?
Well, first of all, we had to have, to comply with HR requirements, we had to ask everybody the same question. So,
all right.
So that's fair. But I would structure my questions so that, one, I would ask you questions to look inside yourself. What would you believe? And some of these would give them a scenario where you're the only officer there. And how are you going to handle the situation? Then I would give the different scenario where you had a team member there. And how did you depend or interact with your team member to successfully resolve that situation. And I usually try to ask a question that there was no right answer, and just to see where you would go with that. So I'm looking, one, can you operate by yourself? But if you have team members, can you work together? And it's much more important now than when I got into business, that you have to be able to work with your team members. And now in our department, they did not ride together, but you always had backup coming. And how are you going to work, especially if you're in investigations, where I spent a majority of my career? How are you and your partner going to work together to solve a case, or how do you fit with each other?
So you mentioned, the military experience is great, but you're really looking for that tenacity. What are some other of the top attributes that you would see in the super successful recruits?
What have you done to prepare yourself before you get there? Either through education, or it was strange. When I got into the business, most of the guys were really pretty physically fit. Later on in the last part of my career, a lot of the applicants were less so. And I had a recruiter. She was a wonderful young officer. And she came to me and was talking to me about, our guys are just having a tough time with the PT tests. And so, well, we're not going to change the standards. I said, here's what let's do. Somebody comes in, let's give them a workout program, so that they can start preparing themselves, because we offered our tests through about 3 times a year. Said, hey, you follow the PT program here, you will most likely pass the test. But are you preparing yourself beforehand? And what are you going to do to prepare yourself after you get hired? What is your next step? And what are you going to do to make yourself better? How are you going to contribute to our department?
I think that's a really huge point that a lot of people miss in any kind of a job interview. There's always a time during the interview. We have a multi-step interview process, but by the time I'm sitting down and meeting with someone, they're qualified. They're qualified to do the job. But one of the things I always ask is for questions. What questions do you have? And that is an open invitation to show me that you've thought through this job, that you've learned something about the firm, and that you've come up with some questions or concerns to ask. And I can't tell you how many people just look at me and say, no, all good, no questions.
Your point is so well taken, because in 2008, when the economic downturn occurred, we had a lot of IT guys applying for jobs because there just weren't anything else out there for those guys. And that was something we asked them, hey, where are you going to be in 3 more years? And they were stuck, because they're used to being on teams, and they knew their contracts were going to end and they would get another one. Now they're in a different world, and they had a difficult time. And it's not that they weren't good people. The police business wasn't for them. That was just, they knew it paid, and it knew it was a good job. And they think, I'll just do what I have to do. That is not the type of person. You've got to be fully committed to that career.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't want a non-fully committed police officer out there, for sure.
Yes.
All right, so you go through the interview process, and then the recruits get into the program. What are some things that you notice there for the successful recruits? Obviously, being physically fit would be incredibly helpful. What are some other traits that maybe would not be so obvious?
Well, one, I always looked at their grades. Hey.
High school, college?
No, they're academy grades.
Gotcha.
Because one of our main academies, we use Collin County Law Enforcement Academy, and we use Council of Governments Academy in Arlington. When I was that commander of that division, I would say, hey, I need to look at their grades. And I'd go by about every other week and say, what do your grades look like? Are you just coasting? And also sometimes would set in on the class to see how much they participated. I really always look for, are you inquisitive, and are you really interested in trying to, it's one thing to sit there and just absorb the information. No, if I'm looking for that person that's going to sit there, absorb the information, and use it for the next step. So I'm looking for those people. Hey, I'm here to learn. And their profession at that point in time was a student. Are you being a professional student? That's what I'm looking for. And attitude is everything.
Curiosity is so important. And it's funny to me because it seems like the over the course of my career, I've become way more curious. I've become interested in different things, and I'm learning different things. And I feel like a lot of the time when we're interviewing people, there's just no curiosity at all. And to me, that suggests like, okay, well, if you're not curious about the firm, if you're not curious about this area of law, if you're not curious about really much of anything, then how are you going to help us improve the firm when you come on board? Because we're always asking people, hey, give us your ideas. What's working? What's not working? And let's brainstorm it and figure out how can we get better as a firm. And if you're not curious, if you're not thinking through ideas or thinking through how to make processes better, we're going to find somebody who is, because that's really important to us.
That is a good point. But one of the things that I have to think about, though, is who this applicant is and where are they in their life. If they're a really young person, they're still trying to figure out who they are. And they haven't had the exposure to be curious about the world yet. But if you're a 10-year officer and you're trying to work your way up, you're going for a promotional exam, I want to know what you know about the world. What is your global or your macro outlook? And tell me what what interests you have besides here, and what have you done to satisfy those interests?
Love it. Love it. All right, so let's get back to your career. So you graduate the police academy. You are police officer. What was your first duty?
I was a lowly patrol officer whose main job was to be seen and not heard.
Right.
And the reason I know that is because the more veteran officers reminded me of that every single day. Now, when you first get out of the academy, obviously you go through a field training phase, and then that lasted, I think, about 3 months, and which the majority of my time. And you understand too, at that time, our city was a very small city, so it wasn't a great learning curve. But as later on, as it began to grow, it's much different. But you go through your field training phase, and when you get cut loose, and you're on your own. I can to this day remember my very first call, and I was so scared because I didn't know where that street was when they gave me that. I knew about where it was, and
before GPS, right?
It was way before GPS, and if you had what was called a MapSco, that was considered high tech, and that was a book of maps, and only a small portion of McKinney was in the MapSco, and fortunately, I drove north on the street I was on and passed it by accident. Yes, it's success. So you go through that, and back then, it was most cities rotated their patrol shifts, and we worked 8-hour shifts back then. Now, most of them work 12-hour shifts now, and so every 6 weeks, your city, your department would rotate shifts. You'd go from days to nights to evenings or something. And one of the things that happened when we first got to our first deep night shift, the sergeant called us all together and told us, we were making a plan. If you caught somebody in a building at night, a burglar, that was the main thing you were supposed to focus on, building burglaries at night. And we were going to make a plan on how we were going to address that. And the sergeant, was going to show up on scene, and the backup officer would go to the rear, and we had a small tactical plan. Well, the first one that happened, I was supposed to go in and search the building. Well, I was the rookie, and they weren't going to go in the building with the rookie, so they sent me to the back of the building to stand to watch that. And it was a kind of a rainy, foggy night. It wasn't cold, it was just rainy, foggy, and I'm at the back. And back then, our radios didn't work very well, especially the handheld. That they might get across the room on broadcast. So
you had no idea what was going on inside.
No, you could hear them, but you just wouldn't transmit. And I see this specter floating about 2 feet off the ground, and there's a fence between it and me. And I watch it, and I thought, holy smoke, it's a ghost. and so I think I pull my handgun out, like, okay, but it's a ghost. You can't shoot a ghost. I pull it out and put it up. I holster my weapon like 3 times, trying to figure out whether I'm going to try to arrest the ghost. And finally, I decided I'm going to get it. And I crawl through about 4 fences, and the ghost is about 150 feet away, and I yell at it, it stops, and it comes back. Because I yell, come back, and it does. And it takes me forever, and I hear this metal clinking and chinking. I think I probably pulled my gun a couple of more times, and finally, judgment says you can't shoot a ghost, so I holster my weapon, and it turns out it's a kid who's wearing a butcher's jacket full of change that he had robbed out of the Coke machine, and every time he took a step, you'd hear the metal clinking.
Oh my goodness!
So my first real arrest by myself happens to be a juvenile that just broke into a Coke machine.
And you thought it was a ghost?
I thought it was a ghost. So that's the nature of police work. It's not. It's exceedingly dangerous because ghosts just this doesn't work that way sometimes.
Yeah, you always hear they exist, and then you see one, right?
Yeah, it's always fun and games till the ghost shows up.
That's funny. All right, so tell me this: as you gained experience as a beat cop, if you will, or as a patrolman, what were some of the things that surprised you, either about yourself or about the job?
In the beginning, what surprised me is how often we dealt with the same people. There are people whose life are so intertwined with the police department. One of the things that I learned, though, one of my training officers was a wonderful, wonderful officer and just one of the best cops that I've ever met. And unfortunately, he passed away. But one of the things that I learned from him was, one, they're people. And no matter how they present themselves, they're people, and treat them with some dignity. And Dave knew everybody, and he knew their mother, and he knew where they lived, and he knew something about them personally. So every time he dealt with them, he could ask them a question about themselves. I did not understand, and he never told me why he did these things. I learned this from watching, and I realized that everybody knew him. And no matter what kind of stress they were under, when Dave showed up, they had a different level of respect for that guy. Now, they may have hated all the rest of us because I was like most officers when I got out of the academy. I knew the law better than anybody else, and I was going to make an impact like no other.
Right.
It took, a couple of years of patrol before I realized that, hey, you have to work within the system, but you can improve the system. But learning about people and how to help them deal with their problems. And you learn it by asking them something personal about themselves or knowing a fact about them. That was amazing how much tension you could take out of the air by just saying, hey, I saw your mom the other day. Is she still living on whatever street? And oh, you saw mom? And that would change people's attitudes.
Yeah, it's a massive de-escalator. Right. Yes. Because you're showing that, hey, there's a bit of a bond here. No matter how small or how light, you know something about them, and that just feels different.
It does. And later on, that's very beneficial because when I went over to investigations, I tried to take that same level of interest in that same line of questioning with me and you would say, hey, I've got this kind of case. Who do I know that does these kind of crimes? And well, I got about 3 guys I can go talk to right now. And so it helped on the investigative side too.
In those first few years when you were a patrolman, outside of the ghosts that you were chasing down, what were some times when you faced a circumstance, an event where you really had to mount up the courage to take the next step? And how did you get there? How did you do that?
Here's one of the things that happened to me is the first year I was there, I got selected to be on a SWAT team. And we went to SWAT school and got some specialized training. And I never had so much a problem with courage to do the job. But one of the things I was definitely afraid of was making mistakes. So we played scenarios in our heads all the time. And I worked deep nights a lot, and we would talk about potential problems. So we would try to always have a plan for no matter what kind of call we were on. Now, you can have all kinds of plans and everything can just go to pot for you. But the main thing, if you can have a preformed plan of response, then you at least can adapt if the circumstances changed. So courage is a big part of it, but being able to keep your mind clear and being able to adapt to the circumstances. And we talked about, we would meet up at night when there weren't calls, and we'd sit and talk about things. How are we going to handle these calls? And one of my SWAT teammates said, we talked about this for years, and we probably didn't have a very major SWAT call out for several years, but we talked about so many things and scenarios. We mined the news constantly. Well, how did these guys do this? How did they do that? And we talked about every scenario that we could possibly think of, so that no matter how the situation presented itself, we had probably talked about it. Now, sometimes you get to a call, and one particular one, when we get to a riot, and they tell us that there's about 20 people involved in this riot, and it wasn't about 20 people, it was about 200. And that was an immediate on the fly, which we just said, hey, let's back off and not agitate all the other people that are showing up. But, we were able to work this out very quickly. It's like, hey, we're outclassed here. We don't have the resources, and we're going to either hurt somebody or hurt ourselves. And we're going to force an issue that we won't have to. And that was one of the things, when to back off and regroup.
What was after you finished your time as a patrolman? What was the next step in your career?
I got selected to go to investigations, I was a burglary detective.
All right.
Which is the worst because your clearance rate is zip. And
you never catch the guy.
What you do is you work your cases, and you'll find one guy that's responsible for 100 burglaries. So you interview everybody until hopefully you can find, and they'll clear them up. And that's, for 3 or 4 months, I had like 0 clearances. And finally one guy gets arrested at night, and I go, hey, just show me wherever you've burgled. And so it was a horrible assignment, but it taught me a lot, because one of the things I learned that most burglars are also dopers. And so if I helped work the dope side of it, I solved a lot of cases or prevented a lot of them too. So, but burglary detective was, I wanted to get it over to crimes against persons as quickly as possible, because your clearance rates are much higher.
So moving forward, you end up managing officers, right? You're a supervisor of some sort or manager. Did you go to any kind of training school on how to train or manage officers?
Yes, it started out, our department in 1987, when I became a supervisor, we sent everybody to Law Enforcement Management Institute. And they really teach you how to be a manager more than a police supervisor. And was my introduction to that world. And it was a required school at our department, and I think they still do that. Let's say there's much better training now that's not just police related; it's personnel related, where you can develop people, your officers coming up as people, not so much as officers. We can give you a lot of specific police training, and there's academies that have instructors that do that constantly. But we want to develop you as a person and make you a better person. And because the better you are at that, I think it translates to a better police supervisor or police officer. But we started out at Law Enforcement Management, and you'd go from there for different specific schools. So
give me some examples of some of the things that you learned on how to better manage people, or how to help become better people.
Yeah, you start learning how to set goals for your officers, and you kind of look at where each officer is in that part of their career. And in those days, we really would the supervisors set goals for them. And it took a while for us to understand that, hey, maybe that's not the best thing to do. Maybe we need to figure out where they want to be and show them how to get there or provide that path. And also too, our city was growing a lot. And so our needs had changed. So we're getting a better class of officer, more educated officer. And so they didn't need sometimes the specific police training. They need personal development training, and we try to send those guys to those kind of schools. So let them decide.
Sure. When you were working with them on developing their own goals, which I think is great, because then they have ownership in it, right? It's not just this number that the boss man's put down that I got to meet. This is something that I helped create, and so you have more ownership over it. What were some of the things that y'all would teach them on goal setting?
Well, some about accountability, but one of the things about the ownership is not only of their career, but hey, why don't you take ownership of your job too? Especially if they're patrol officers, they worked assigned beats, so they needed to know who the people in their beat were. You need to know who are the community leaders. You needed to be able to, if you had an issue, to be able to contact those community leaders. Hey, who have you talked to about these things that are occurring in your beat? But the other thing too is not only who are those community leaders, but how is this affecting others in other parts of the town and other departments? Say you have a specific crime going on. Is it affecting parks? Is it affecting streets? Is it affecting fire department? One of the things that I'll give you a case in point where we had guys that were stealing wire off of the railroad. No, we don't own the railroad, and you can't find a phone number to a railroad person. But I know that every time this long strip of wire was stolen, it shut the train down for about 3 days till they could get out and replace it. Well, that affected a lot of things. So, what is it that you're doing, and who else is involved, and try to not think about this specific crime today, but how is it affecting the overall quality of life for the rest of the people in that district?
Now, you've also had some media training that you went through as a police officer. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that, and your biggest takeaways from your media training.
Yeah, don't wear your sunglasses during an interview, no matter how much that reporter asks you for an interview. No, one of the things I always tried to do is make sure I had the knowledge of what they were going to talk about and have an idea of how I was going to respond. I tried to prepare myself before every interview, even if it was just an impromptu interview at a crime scene. So I always had a message that I was going to convey, not let the interviewer run that show, as opposed to like today where it's all interview driven. But
right.
it's a different concept today, what we're doing here.
And so were there some tips or techniques that you learned in terms of crafting the message that you wanted to get across to whoever was listening?
One of the things that is important is you are speaking on behalf of the department to the public, and there needs to be a message. If, say, we talked earlier about a wreck that we worked all day. Well, this affected thousands of people that day. We had to reroute traffic. We disrupted a lot of lives. So one of the things you need to have is a message like, here's what happened, here's why it happened, here's what we did about it. And so people will take a lot of discomfort if they know why. It's those times when nobody's answering their questions or not sufficiently answering their questions, they get frustrated. And then when they get frustrated, they sometimes do things that are not the smartest in the world. So know how what you're doing affects the public, and we are public servants. There's a reason we call it that, and you need to never forget that.
What was your favorite job throughout your entire career that you had at the police department?
Probably as an investigative supervisor of some sort. You had the greatest amount of impact on the most lives. We don't know how often we prevent crime. So people come to the police department because something bad has happened in their life. And what you can do is try to mitigate those circumstances that happen. We can't ever take away what happened, but we can try to make your life better from that point forward. And we're not always successful, but we need to try, because people have been through some terrible situations. So it's your job to try to stop the hurt if you can.
Was there a specific case you worked or a seminal point of your career where that's the thing that you would always go back to say, yeah, I'm absolutely doing exactly what I was made to do?
Yeah, I think that probably occurred in 1990 when I had one of my first major murder case. I'd worked many others, but we had a stockbroker in our town that was lured away from his office and ultimately killed over in Frisco. And we involved many agencies and the FBI. And I at some point in time, it occurred to me that I am about a 7-year officer I've got about 20 people working for me, and you need to do the very best you can for the family. Because you get so focused on the crime, you sometimes forget about the victims. And the victims aren't just the person that something happened to. It's all those people connected to it. And at some point in time, I was talking to the wife of this, the man that was deceased. And it struck me as like, I'm going to do everything I can. I can't stop what happened, but I'm going to do everything I can for you because this is a thoroughly decent family. And then when I learned the suspect's family were some of the nicest, kindest people that you could ever imagine. And my suspect was just an outlier and nobody really knew what kind of person he was. I'm like, okay, I have really got to expand my horizons and not just focus only on the crime. I had a big learning curve during that case.
Yeah, it's amazing. We go into professions with, kind of the primary of want to help people. Right. I want to help the victims of and their families that we serve. You want to help victims and make cities a safer place to be. But in the course of doing what we do in those jobs, it's so easy to get focused in on the case for you, the case for me. Hey, here's the damages model that we're working through. Here's the liability issues that we have. Here's the experts that we need to hire. And you have a plaintiff over here, a victim or a crime victim. It's easy to lose the focus of them. And so we're constantly, in our office trying to remind ourselves, hey, look, we reach out to them regularly. And before you make that phone call, you take a deep breath and you're like, all right, I'm about to talk to a victim here, a victim's family. Let me get in the right headspace because we may be excited about a new development. They're not. They're worried about their loved one or they're going through grief.
You can't let the system take over and forget the humanity. One of the things that happened is when the state mandated that we have victims assistance coordinators to liaise with the family and keep them apprised of the developments. And we had a person in our department that was her sole job to walk the victim's family or whatever through the system. And sometimes there were benefits that they could help them with. But your point is so good is that the system doesn't always provide humanity that we need to remember.
Absolutely. All right. So you finish out this long police career. What led you to the decision to retire and then to run for mayor? The local politics can be pretty nasty.
Sometimes, yes. When I knew I had 35 years in as an officer, my time was about, and there were really good guys there. And I spent the last year and a half with a new lieutenant preparing him for taking over that job. Really super good guy. And you just know when your time is up, or you should know. And because the job changes and you have to evolve. And at some point in time, your evolution phase is over. And I was tired. And, like most guys, your body is pretty used up at that point in time. And so I did retire, and we had purchased an old home to restore. And so the day that I left the PD, the next day I had a tool belt. I traded a gun belt for a tool belt and went to work working in this old home. And my wife had a bakery in a small town, and the call originally came to her from some of our friends, said, hey, we'd like for you to run for council. And she says, I really don't have time for that, but you ought to ask Steve to do this. And I said, you really don't want me. I'm a little too direct. I don't really have, you're exactly what we need. You're exactly what we need. I said, no. I promise you, I am not what you need. I'm exactly the opposite of everything. And at that time, there were a few issues going on, and I told them, I said, hey, what if I attend a meeting and I give you some pointers about, hey, here's some things to do and maybe some things to say and ways to address it. And they said, sure, come on. And I got into a room with 4 women and 1 guy. He was already committed to run, and I don't know what happened, but those women in about 15 minutes had me brainwashed, and I was carrying my own sign out the door. Yes, I can. And I don't even remember saying yes, but they had me turned inside out.
They were good.
And I never saw it coming. They just steamrolled me, made me a badge and wore me. And so we had 3 candidates for mayor, and unfortunately, I guess some of them weren't the best. So I got 70% of the vote, but I didn't win the election on election day. I won the election when we had meet the candidates night, because we all were in a room at the college, and I had prepared. I had pulled the budgets for 3 years. I had watched previous city council meetings, and I knew most of the issues back and forth. And none of the questions pertain to budget. I was kind of a budget hawk, because I had prepared the budget for our department, for our division, for several years. So I was really well versed on the money part. They never asked those things. One of the guys had apparently in the past had a family violence arrest in his file, and the other youngest opponent says, "Well, I got arrested last year, but I never beat my wife like this guy."
Oh no!
And so I won the election that night, because he makes the mistake of trying to explain it, but he compounds it with saying, "Well, who's never been in trouble?" So I just raised my hand, and there were probably 50 people in the meeting, and it was over that night. They just didn't know it.
Ouch.
And it was an interesting experience as mayor. It was, I learned a lot. I learned more about water and sewer than anybody needs to know.
It is
amazing.
Do
know that people will come to your house and knock on the door if you fail a water test.
Oof. All right. So we're running low on time, but I do want to give you a few minutes to talk about Cobalt. So tell us what services you provide.
We primarily work on background investigations, personal injury, and criminal cases. However, it seems like those drawing on my strengths from a police investigation, but two of my cases have involved missing persons, and one of my biggest cases that I'm working now, family contacted me to try to find a missing sibling. He's been gone for 40 years, and this guy has just dropped off the face of the earth. And I ended up going to Oklahoma City last week, following up on a lead. So it's one of those things that it's very important to them. So I'm going to pursue this to the end till we find this guy.
Awesome. All right. So last question that I always ask everybody: give me your top 3 favorite books.
Usually my favorite book is whatever I'm reading now, and I just picked up a book about Lewis and Clark. So I'm gonna break that open, and I have a book on my desk that I've had for a couple of years. I haven't read. It's called Win, and it's leadership strategies for police officers and leaders. So those are my next 2 on my list to read.
All right, historical and technical. I like it.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Driven Crowd podcast today. We appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Driven Crowd podcast.